welcome to another episode of the Alley Report, part of the Service Department. Today we are talking with Peter O'Keefe, author of Counted with the Dead, and filmmaker, documentary filmmaker. He's done a little bit of everything. Thanks for coming on here.
Well, thank you. This is cool. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. Um, so Counted with the Dead is your first novel.
That's correct. That's correct. I've got a lot of other experience, but it's my first novel. Yeah, so it's pretty exciting. I'm pretty proud of it.
Yeah, I mean it's just a cool concept, like reimagining Frankenstein, but setting it in Detroit, in the '90s, during when there was just a lot of like conflict happening, racial conflict happening.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, my first 3 decades of my life were in Detroit, so all my writing tends to go back to that. All my stories seem to come out of that, just because it was such a time filled with just different energies, conflicts and energies, and great things were happening and not so great things were happening. And, it was just really influential. And the screenplay, it originally started as a screenplay, Counter with the Dead. Um, and I wrote it at a very, very dark time in my life, because my brother, who was just slightly over a year older than I am, was dying of AIDS at the time. So I was kind of in this dark place, and I was, I'd been writing for the show called Tales from the Dark Side. I was trying to break into screenwriting. I was writing this script, and I'd had this Frankenstein Mafia idea for a long time, and then it just grew from there. But it just got very dark, very complicated, and it was, to me, just an interesting take on the whole Frankenstein story. And instead of the Alps, it's abandoned skyscrapers in late '90s Detroit. And the mad scientist, is a completely different, more malevolent force than in the original Frankenstein, and the Frankenstein monster is a little bit more, you know, more of a malevolent force as well, because of his twisted psyche. But so yeah, so it started from there. It got me. It was optioned probably 9 or 10 times at least,
Oh,
and never got made. It was always too dark. In those days, the term they used, too urban, and it was just the wrong place at the wrong time. Even though people loved it enough to option it, it could never get past the gatekeepers
yeah.
at the studios. Um, so I put it in a drawer for a long time, and then um, just it just kind of lived in my psyche. I just wanted to tell this story, and I finally sat down and a few years ago and wrote it as a novel. And I think that's what I should have done in the first place, because there's just so much more complexity. There's so much more character development. In a screenplay, your character development is basically all through dialogue.
Yeah.
And I was able to give the characters inner lives, and really work on the relationship between the two brothers and the various other characters, and really, really describe the geography of Detroit in those days, which was a completely different city than the Detroit of today. It was, entire blocks of abandoned office towers and hotels in downtown Detroit, which was a great setting for a horror movie.
Yeah.
And an enormous, enormous abandoned train station, enormous abandoned factories. It was just, it was a playground for a story like that. And in the novel, I could get into much more detail with that.
And you don't have to sacrifice anything. I feel like had it gone into production, like in the like late '90s, early 2000s, I feel like they would have chopped up so much of what you're describing, like all the personal things, all the trying to
Hmm.
capture that
Hmm.
moment in time. I feel like they would have just, I feel like it would have been massacred.
Oh, definitely. I mean, that actually happened once, in the development process. We A producer optioned it. He wanted to take it to this guy at one of the studios who was one of these people that could get a movie made if you wanted it. And we went through his assistant, and his assistant said, well, I like this. Let me make a few changes before you show it to my boss. And so this person directed us to make all these changes, just draft after draft after draft, oh, it's too dark, change this. Oh, it's, you can't kill all these people, change this. And then at the end, she goes, I just don't know what I liked about the script in the beginning. I just don't like it. And I was like, yeah, because you took everything, you took all
Yeah,
the edge out of it, so I'm glad it didn't get made as a movie.
yeah.
But those weren't all bad experiences either, because there was another producer who read it and liked it. And he says to me, and this is early on in the process, this isn't a horror story to me. This is a story about two brothers. And I had never thought about that. It never crossed my mind in writing it or reading it afterwards. And I was like, yeah, this is a story about two brothers, because I was thinking so much about my brother, who was ill at the time. And I was continuing to write it after he passed away. So in the novel, I could really go much more deeply into that relationship, even though the relationship in Kind of with the Dead has nothing to do with the relationship with my actual brother.
But like you can see you lose someone. So the story of Frankenstein, that you can defeat death and bring them back. And also, I feel like there was such a stigma then for people who had AIDS, and they were treated, and as always were treated like they were a monster. And um,
Oh
I
yeah, I
could
mean it
see
was.
all that just feeding into the story.
Oh yeah, into that darkness, and yeah, and I mean it was those days. It was like the early days of COVID. Nobody knew what was going on, and they were just terrified of anyone that had the disease. So yeah, it was a very dark time. Um, and yeah, but something came out of it. I think a
Yeah,
good story. So,
and it's always interesting whenever you write something and you put so much into it, when someone just standing outside can say, "Oh, it's about this," like saying it's about these brothers. And that's always fascinating that happened when it's like people can see what you couldn't see even though it was there.
oh yeah, I mean that I'm constantly surprised by someone else who read the book was saying to me, "Oh, I see you did the ending so that there can be a sequel." And I was like, what? I never gave that a moment's thought, but then I reread the ending. I was like, well, yeah, I guess you could see it that way. Yeah. So people, yeah, readers give you such a different perspective sometimes. And it's really interesting.
Um, yeah, and also you mentioned, I know you were talking to me earlier before we got recording about out of the writers, you have a million different day jobs and things you've done, and you've written in possibly every arena that can be written in. But I don't know. I didn't realize Tales from the Dark Side that you written for that, because I love that show.
Yeah. That was pretty much my first paid writing gig. I was living in New York, and there used to be this thing called the Writers Guild Fellowship, which they don't do anymore. Um, and you'd write a spec script, and submit it, and it was a contest, and they'd select 8 or 9 or 10 writers, and you'd receive a fellowship from the Writers Guild, and they'd assign a working writer to you as a mentor. It was a great program. It's too bad it's not around anymore. But so I was awarded a fellowship. Out of that, I got an agent. Out of that, I started pitching the Tales from the Dark Side. Um, yeah, and you know, it was a nice break, although it didn't lead to any meteoric rise. It was from there. It was constant struggle, constant get a writing assignment, work as an office temp, you know,
Yeah,
option something, work as an office temp. It went on like that for quite a while.
yeah. That's one thing that's kind of overlooked, like especially among like young writers or people just starting out, is the idea that, oh, it's rungs on a ladder, but they never tell you you're going to go back down if you don't just keep moving forward. Suddenly you're at the bottom again. And yeah, like I've had friends that had great gigs writing on shows, and it's like, oh, this is it. I've done it, and then that show's canceled. It's like,
Mhm.
oh,
Yeah, yeah,
okay, back to Starbucks
yeah.
until I get another gig.
yeah, and Tales from the Dark Side went away, and and I was at a bit of a disadvantage because I never went to film school. I never, I was never part of that world, and so I didn't have that contact base
Yeah.
that you really need to succeed in something like that. And so I eventually bailed on that. It was too many times of having to take a break and be an office temp. And after a while, I was like, well, it's just never going to be consistent.
Yeah.
And then I just did 100 different things. I made commercials and documentaries and training videos and lots of educational videos, and lots of marketing videos for companies. And then when I made a lot of short films, a lot of for myself, little short horror films and that sort of thing, and a couple of documentaries. One of them, we were very excited. Was awarded an Emmy. Um, and
Was that
then
Dreaming in Public?
Dreaming in Public, yes, about artists in the Midwest. We had moved to South Bend, Indiana, for a job my wife had, and I was kind of fascinated I met these artists there who were serious artists, serious working artists. And, they weren't in Chicago, they weren't on the West Coast, they weren't on the East Coast, but they were somehow surviving as artists, kind of in flyover country. So that really fascinated me, and I wanted to tell their story. So I made a documentary about several of them, which was kind of well received. And
And you also did
but anyways, I'm sorry, what's that?
oh, sorry, I was also gonna bring up you did the short film like Race Memory, which it's
Oh,
been out
yes,
for
yes.
from 2000, and that was like the almost cyclical nature of just like racial conflict, how it just feeds one generation to the next, to the next, to the next, and
Yeah, and that's always, yeah, even in Counted with the Dead, it's not a racial story, but there's definitely racial elements because you can't set a story in Detroit and not have um,
yeah,
the story be about race at one level or not. Yeah, and so that short film was directly about race, and it was funny because I found this bar where they let me shoot it, and only after we started shooting did I discover it was a cop bar. It's where all the
oh,
locals hung out, and it was a short film that was not very complimentary, of police officers. So it's an interesting dynamic. Um, but yeah, so I mean, if I had it to do over again, if I had a time machine, I would start writing the novels right away. I wouldn't have waited this long, because I just feel like it just feels the that genre just feels right to me. I just like telling stories as novels.
yeah. I mean, you have more power over your stories, and it's not as there's not that collaboration that can sometimes saw the edges off. Like,
Hmm. Hmm.
um, because I know, I did, you know, playwriting for a little while, but I have friends that have done well at it, but they always talk about, the reading them to death. We're gonna do a stage reading,
Hmm.
another stage reading, another stage reading, and by the time you've done 20 stage readings, like, they've smoothed your play into this nice round, boring ball. Not
Hmm.
always, but
Hmm.
sometimes that can happen.
Yeah, and it's just tough. It's tough, because I was trying that for a while. I was working a day job. I was writing screenplays. I was writing plays, and just after a while, you got to say, I got to focus on one thing.
Yeah.
And eventually it became novels, and part of it was, I enjoyed making the documentaries. I enjoyed a lot of the things I did, but I was always telling someone else's story. And I just got to the point, you know, I really want to tell a story that I want to tell, a story that's really about my background, about, my life, growing up in Detroit, and the people I met, the stories I heard, 'cause I just wanted to weave all these stories into one novel. Because like I said, I lived there for 3 decades. I, I knew just I was a bartender a couple different times, just knew lots of different people, heard and saw lots of different stories. I had a roommate at one time, shared an apartment with a guy, an ex-Detroit cop, and met all his buddies who were still on the force, and used to go drinking tequila shots, flaming tequila shots, and smoking dope with Detroit cops, off-duty cops, and the stories you hear, you're just kind of like, man, I want to use that someday.
Yeah.
And in this book, I use some of them. So.
I mean, was there like almost a cathartic feeling about completing this novel? 'Cause it sounds like, I mean, it's been with you for decades at this point, like in one form or another. Even if it's in a drawer, it's never gone away. You've never forgotten about it.
Yeah, it was my white whale, you know.
Yeah.
It was my Moby Dick because I just kept coming back to it. I kept having other options. I can go do this, I can go do that. And even after writing it, I was not having much success, querying with it. And I was like, God damn it, I want to find a way to do this. And I ended up was very fortunate. I was on Twitter with a bunch of writers, and one of them was Gabino Iglesias, who, well known for his horror crime novels, The Devil Takes You Home and House of Bone and Rain, and he signed on to edit it. And it was a painful process. Lost 10,000 words, but I think it made it a better book. And then I went back out again, and it was still hard. It was still like I was constantly like, oh, I'm beating my head against the wall. Nobody wants this kind of story anymore. When it was a screenplay, it was getting optioned all the time, but then the same story as a novel, people were kind of shrugging sometimes. And but I stuck with it and found a publisher that liked it, and the reviews have been pretty good so far. So yeah, onward and upward.
Yeah. I'm glad you stuck with it. Um, and yeah, the editing process can be good, especially, it's got to be nice when someone like Gabino, who loves the genre and like
Oh yeah.
truly wants to help make you the best book possible. But yeah, sometimes you get those pages, it can almost make you feel like, well, I don't know what I'm doing. Like I'm getting the pages are this marked up.
And also with him, he kind of inspired me even before he became my editor, because he's a writer who I discovered on Twitter, and started reading his books. And this is in the early days of writing kind of with the dead, and it kind of gave me permission. I was like, oh, there are people writing in this genre, this kind of dark horror crime genre that is kind of in some ways somewhat political and has
Yeah,
a message. And because I kind of thought, well, no one's doing this, and I was like, oh, there are some really good writers, really successful writers doing this sort of thing. So that in a way, it kind of gave me the confidence to keep working on it.
yeah. Um, and yeah, we talk about it's just funny. I keep seeing it pushed a lot, and I recently on social media thing pushing about trying to avoid politics in your books. Like if you want people to read it, it's like I don't. As a reader, I want a book that has something to say. That you can tell there's something to it. I don't know.
Hmm.
I don't like the idea of oatmeal as a book, which is what it seems like a lot of
Yeah.
these people are like. That's what you need to make it. Make it as harmless as possible. Like
No, that's like I
chicken's a
said,
simple.
I was just, kind of really excited when I found books like that, by writers like that, by Gabino and other writers. And, I, yeah, my heart and soul goes into these things, and my politics. I mean, not directly,
Yeah,
but it certainly influences the characters and how they relate to each other, and, the politics of the story itself, racial relations and things. It certainly influences all those things. And I want to read stuff like that. I want to read books that are
yeah,
dense like that. And, you know, even if they piss me off sometimes, it's better than, I mean, a straightforward, thriller or horror is great. And I read those a lot. I like them a lot, but I really like it when they go more into depth into, kind of more serious issues.
Yeah, because those tend to stick with you more. Like they're because yeah, because I've read some horror novels that was like, oh yeah, that was good, but it doesn't stick with me.
Hmm. Hmm.
It didn't provoke feeling in me or emotion. It didn't, like you said, like it didn't piss me off. It didn't, actually frighten me or things like that.
Because, I mean, I've got stacks of horror novels I've read, and I just don't remember any of them really. But then but you read something by Haley Piper, or
Yeah,
Gabino, or Laurel Hightower, and it's like, oh yeah, I remember that story. Because
yeah,
they're about more than just a straightforward, telling a tale, you know.
yeah. So, to the people that are listening or watching, it's like if you're writing, don't get political and weird. And if it seems like no one's doing something like this, like that's the instinct. That's a good instinct. Go for that. Go for the thing. It's like I don't know anyone else besides me that would want this. So there's someone out there.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's just I think you're a better writer when you do something like that. I went through a stage when I was trying to break in as a screenwriter where I started trying to write what I thought people wanted. And I just think that's a huge mistake. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to write a novel. It's like, I don't care if no one wants to read a book set in Detroit. I don't care if no one wants a book with this going on or that going on, or, these type of characters or these descriptions, these kind of dense descriptions of the architecture of the city. I don't care. I'm just going to write it and see if anyone else, feels like me and wants to read something like that. And I think that's the way you have to do it.
Yeah. And it's such a like Detroit is such a throughout its history is such an interesting city. What was God, I read a book recently that was set in the 70s in Detroit. And it was the same thing. It was like we're gonna take you into this world and see what it was like, and
Hmm.
it was set among like the upper crust of the city, but it was there's what was it called, the babysitter, I think.
Oh yeah, I'm not familiar with it. I have to look it up. But
Yeah, yeah, it was good. But it was the same thing. It was really like chapters about the city. I mean, like I said, architecture, things like that, but it just really drew you into it. Um,
yeah, and the history of the city has always fascinated me. I mean, my grandfather worked at, Dodge Main Auto Plant for 40 years, and which was torn down while I was in college. It was a small city. It was enormous. Um, and I had friends in art school. I went to art school in Detroit, who, just set up spaces in an abandoned office tower and, ran power lines to the outside and, and just used those spaces, and so just, you know, the things that they went through and the stories they told and the stories I heard as a bartender in Detroit and the things I saw, you just, it's like, man, I want to weave these all into a story and kind of the whole through line was Frankenstein, and it was also and this was kind of part of the original the original idea was how far can you go, because I've raised Catholic, educated by nuns and priests all the way through high school. Um, and it's kind of the thing where you sit in a confessional and you say, Father, I have sinned, and you tell him your sins and it's forgiven. And I was like, well, how far can you go? I mean, can you kill people and be forgiven? So I just came up with the story of this killer, this hitman who has killed lots of people, and now he's like seen the light and he wants to change. And he goes to a priest, and the priest says, I'm not giving you absolution. You've done nothing to make up for all the things you've done. And he doesn't know what to do. And then he encounters this creature made from the bodies of his victims. So he's literally confronted with the horrors of his past and has to figure out, how do I, number one, deal with this beast, and how do I, number two, get absolution for all the horrible things I've done in my life? And so that's kind of, it just came from that very dark place. Um, and you know, it's a very Catholic story in a lot of ways, from a very fallen away Catholic.
Um, I have a few friends that some are authors, some are not, but the fallen away Catholic about how some things don't leave you even if you want them to. Even if you would love for them to leave you, like they just it like sticks with you and
Oh
a lot
yeah,
of horror
yeah,
stories like especially about nuns. Like I don't know why in pop culture they're seen as like adorable or cute. I've heard nothing but horror stories. Like
well, I created a web series about nuns. You should go to my website, Sister Mary Martha's Martyrology, about a Sister Mary Martha interviews the dead Christian martyrs on her talk show, and what could possibly go wrong, things she's able to bring them back to life. And yeah, so yeah, it is a big influence. People ask, what makes you become a horror writer? And at least for me, I think, you grow up looking at, you know, these crucifixes with a guy nailed to it, and hearing stories of people being martyred and people being thrown to lions and people being chopped up. And I remember this nun in first or second grade telling us stories of entire families being thrown into, cauldrons of boiling oil because they wouldn't, step away from their faith, disown their faith. And it's like, how can you not become a horror writer
yeah,
growing up listening to these stories,
yeah, because mine is it was I grew up rural Texas, so it was more on the evangelical side of things. But like I
Hmm.
remember like being awake at night, like you know, as a child, like really little, being terrified of hell and what awaited me, and like being 6 and reading the part where Matthew, where God's like, I'm gonna say, get behind me, get away from me, like I'm gonna turn you away at heaven.
Hmm.
That's what he's gonna do. That's what he's gonna do, and I'm gonna go to hell. And I'm like,
Yep. Yep. Yeah. And
I'm
it's,
like,
it's,
that's
yeah,
terror.
Catholicism is very similar. It's a very, especially back in those days, there's all the talk about hellfire, and God's going to punish you. And, in first grade, we had this nun who, I know I'm talking about nuns all the time now, but she was like, I lived in a 2-bedroom house with an attic where the 5 boys slept in one bathroom. And this nun is telling us, if you do not bathe every night, that's a sin and you're going to hell. And I'm sitting there, my little first grade, you know, conscience going, oh my God, we we get we get to use the bathtub one day a week. I'm like, I'm going to hell. So yeah, it is amazing that the guilt trips they could lay on you,
Yeah,
and really it impacts you
yeah,
for life.
yeah. I mean, it sticks with you because I mean, especially like it's hammered into you how worthless you are. Like it's hammered, like, and you that stays with you, and ugh,
Yeah, and it's not, yeah, it's all about fear, fear
yeah,
of, of stepping on that line, stepping on that crack in the sidewalk, and that's a sin, and you're going to go to hell. And it's like, yeah, that's part of the reason I'm a fallen away Catholic.
yeah. Like um and you know Frankenstein being such an influence. What was your first encounter of Frankenstein? Like
I think I read it in high school. Yeah, and it's just one of the, and it's like, how old was Mary Shelley when she wrote that? I forget. She was like in her early
18,
20s, which,
19.
yeah, astonishing. It's astonishing. But yeah, it's a story that it just stuck with me. I mean, the vampire stories, the zombie stories, they were fun, but something about this Frankenstein, this creature, with someone else's brain and created from, body parts of other people, and the whole master creation thing,
Yeah,
the Frankenstein and his monster thing. Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's when I just kept, I in high school, I probably read that, 3 or 4 times. That book just really, really kind of grabbed me, that whole mythology. And, because I was always also really into, Greek mythology. in the stories of gods and, and men with hubris and, going too far and being punished by the gods. And somehow Frankenstein kind of fit into that same trajectory. It kind of came out of that same, world of gods and demons and, monsters and Cyclops and, Odysseus and all that stuff. So yeah, yeah, it's still one of my favorite books. And yeah, and yeah, to me, writing, you know, a similar story, it was, very much, I didn't have the Swiss Alps, but I had these abandoned skyscrapers, to play with. And I didn't have Dr. Frankenstein, but I had my own Dr. Frankenstein and his kind of Rube Goldbergian, technology and you know, I was able to weave in, the world of art, because I was an art student. So the years I lived in, a lot of the years I lived in Detroit, it was very much about that world. So I really wanted to weave that into the story. And the guy who becomes the beast is an art collector, and that's kind of the way he looks at the world. Is kind of impacted by his love for art when he was a normal person before he became a beast.
Man. Well, thank you again for coming on here. This has been awesome. And yeah, anyone watching or listening, pick up, Counted with the Dead. It's really good, and you need to read it.
And not to mention Bishop Ryder Lives. A couple good stories in there too.
Yeah,
I had
yeah,
four writers present.
yeah. That's true. That's true.
Yeah,
I'm so excited to get into that. I still don't know how it happened.
yeah, yeah. That was fun. That was a lot of
Yeah.
fun. Moving into
Well,
someone else's world and writing a story. So,
yeah. Well,
so yeah,
thank you.
yeah. This has been fun. I'm glad I was able to come on and do this. You know, hopefully do it again for the next book.
Hey,
Um,
if I'm still doing this, then
yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Well,
All
thank
I gotta
you.
do is find someone that wants it.
Hey, that's the struggle, but you will.
Yeah.